Garrett's boot connected with her ribs before she even hit the floor. Nola curled around her belly, both arms wrapped tight over the swell of it. Her only thought, protect the baby, protect the baby, protect the baby. "You think this child saves you?" he spat, crouching down, grabbing a fistful of her hair, yanking her face up to his. His eyes were empty. That was the worst part, not the rage, but the emptiness behind it. "Nothing saves you from me." He pressed his thumb hard into the bruise on her wrist, watching her flinch, and he smiled. That night she ran, straight into the one life she never saw coming. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart pounding, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where everything truly began. The Brennan estate sat at the end of a long private road that most people in the city didn't even know existed. It wasn't the kind of place that appeared on maps or in conversations at dinner parties. It was the kind of place that people whispered about and then immediately pretended they hadn't. 3 stories of dark stone and iron gates surrounded by manicured grounds that stretched wider than most city blocks. To the outside world, it was simply the home of a very wealthy, very private man. To those who worked within its walls, it was something else entirely. Callum Brennan had not always lived like this. There had been a time, a long time ago now, when he slept on a mattress on the floor of a 2-room apartment in South Boston, when the heat only worked half the time, and dinner was whatever his mother could stretch from a $10 bill. He remembered those years with a clarity that never faded, no matter how many miles and how much money now separated him from them. He had clawed his way out of that life through a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and a particular talent for understanding what people wanted and what they feared. Now, at 43, Callum Brennan was not a man people refused lightly. He ran 3 legitimate businesses and 1 very illegitimate empire. His name moved through certain circles, the way a storm moved through a quiet town. People braced for it. People prepared. And people, if they were smart, stayed out of his way. He was not cruel for the sake of cruelty. That distinction mattered to him, though he doubted many would understand it. He had rules. He had a code. He had built something that functioned, that provided, that protected those loyal to him. And he had learned the very hard way that sentiment was a liability he could not often afford. He had learned to keep his heart behind glass. That particular Tuesday night in October, Callum came home after 11. His car pulled through the gate. The gravel crunched under his shoes as he walked to the front entrance, and his housekeeper, Mrs. Doyle, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 60s, who had worked for him for 8 years, met him in the foyer with a glass of bourbon she had already poured because she knew his schedule better than he did. "Long day," she said. It wasn't a question. "Long enough," he replied, accepting the glass. He loosened his tie with 2 fingers as he moved through the main hall, heading toward his office. The house was quiet. Most of the staff had gone home. The cleaners ran a skeleton crew for late-night maintenance, 2 or 3 people who came through after the household had settled quiet as ghosts, and Callum rarely paid them much attention. They were background. They were part of the house's breathing. He was nearly to his office door when he heard something fall. It was a small sound, a cloth slipping off a shelf or a bottle tipping over. Nothing alarming, but Callum was a man trained by years of survival to register every sound, every shift in the air, every detail that didn't quite fit. He stopped walking. He turned. At the far end of the corridor near the tall shelving unit, where Mrs. Doyle kept the decorative pieces that Callum had never particularly cared about, but had never bothered removing, a woman stood on a step stool reaching upward to replace a small vase she had apparently knocked loose. She was young, somewhere in her early 30s probably, and very visibly pregnant. Her uniform was the standard one the cleaning service provided, dark gray with a white collar. But it fit her poorly now, stretched across her middle, in a way that must have been uncomfortable. She hadn't noticed him yet. She was focused entirely on the shelf, her arm extended, her balance precarious, and then her sleeve slipped back. Callum saw the bruises before he understood what he was seeing. A cluster of them, deep purple, fading to sick yellow at the edges, wrapping around her wrist like a second skin. The kind of bruise that didn't come from bumping into furniture, the kind that came from fingers. From gripping. Something in his chest went very still. She got the vase back on the shelf, stepped carefully down from the stool, and turned around. And then she saw him standing there in the half-dark of the corridor, and the color drained entirely from her face. For a moment, neither of them moved. Callum looked at her. He looked at her face, at the line of her jaw, at the way her eyes were large and watchful, and already calculating the distance to the nearest exit, and something cracked open in the back of his memory, like a door that had been sealed shut for a very long time. "Nola," he said. He said it quietly, almost to himself, like a word he was testing the weight of. She flinched, just barely. Just a slight tightening around her eyes and mouth, but he caught it, because he always caught everything. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, her voice professional and flat, and entirely unlike the voice he remembered. "I knocked the vase. I put it back. I didn't break anything." "Nola Ferris," he said. She went completely still. "I think you have me confused with someone else," she said. But her voice had changed. Something had crept into it. Something careful and frightened. Callum took a step toward her, and she took one back, her hand going automatically to her belly in that gesture that pregnant women made without thinking, the instinctive shield. He stopped. He held up his hands, both of them palms open. It was not a gesture he made often. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "I never hurt anyone who doesn't deserve it, and you don't." He paused. "You never did." She stared at him. Her eyes were brown. He had forgotten that. Brown and very sharp, and right now shining with something she was working very hard to contain. "Callum," she whispered. Not a greeting, more like something escaping before she could stop it. "Yeah," he said. "It's me." For a moment he thought she might run. He could see her thinking about it, see the calculation moving behind her eyes. And then something in her seemed to give way, some small internal structure that had been holding everything up, and she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and looked away from him at the wall. "I didn't know this was your house," she said. "I just needed the work. The agency placed me here. I didn't know." "How long have you been here?" he asked. 3 weeks. 3 weeks. She had been working in his house for 3 weeks, and he hadn't seen her once. That stung in a way he hadn't anticipated. "Come with me," he said. "Mr. Brennan. Callum. I've been Callum to you since we were 7 years old, and that is not going to change tonight." He said it firmly, but not unkindly. "Come sit down. You shouldn't be standing on step stools in your condition." She hesitated. He could see the war in her. The part of her that wanted to refuse, that had learned to refuse help on principle because help always came with a price. And the part of her that was exhausted and scared and pregnant and had been standing on her feet since God knows what hour. The exhaustion won. It usually did. He led her to the small sitting room off the main hall, the one he used for informal meetings, and he turned on a single lamp and gestured to the settee, and she sat on the very edge of it, like she was ready to spring back up at any moment. He poured her a glass of water from the pitcher on the side table and set it within reach, and then pulled a chair across from her and sat down. He looked at her properly for the first time. She was 32. He knew that because he was 32 when they had last known each other, 11 years old, and then her family had moved away from the neighborhood, and she had simply ceased to exist in his life the way people did when you were children, with no phones and no way to find each other. He had thought about her over the years, but abstractly, the way you thought about anything you'd lost before you understood what losing meant. She looked like someone who had been through something long and hard. Not broken, not exactly, but worn down to a particular kind of thin. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't come from one bad night. Her wrists, where the sleeves had fallen back slightly as she sat, showed the bruising he had already seen. And there on her left cheekbone, almost but not quite hidden by the angle of the light, was the faint yellow ghost of something older. His jaw tightened. He kept his expression neutral with some effort. "Tell me you're safe," he said. She laughed. It came out wrong, too short and too hollow. "Define safe." "Nola." "I'm fine," she said. "I'm working. I have a place to stay. The baby is healthy. The doctor says so." She said it like a list of facts, like she was reading from a report. "I'm fine." "Who did that to your wrist?" She looked down at it. She pulled her sleeve over it with a practiced automatic motion. "I bruise easily," she said. That is not a bruise from bruising easily. That is a bruise from someone's hand. The silence stretched out between them. His name was Garrett, she finally said, and the past tense of it was the loudest thing in the room. Callum waited. We were together for 4 years, she said slowly. The first year was good. Or I thought it was good. Now when I look back, I can see it wasn't that the signs were there, but you don't see what you don't want to see. She pressed her lips together. The second year he started getting angry a lot. Small things. The way I folded laundry. The way I talked to the cashier at the grocery store. Things that weren't things. And I told myself he was stressed, he was having a hard time, it would pass. Her voice was very level. She had clearly told this story before to herself, if no one else had worn it smooth through repetition. It didn't pass. How bad did it get? Callum asked. She looked at him directly for the first time since they had sat down. There was something in her eyes that was beyond sadness, something more like the kind of quiet that comes after a storm has already destroyed everything there was to destroy. Bad enough, she said. And the baby, he doesn't know. Something shifted in her expression, the first real emotion he had seen in it, and it was fierce and ferocious and entirely maternal. He will never know. That is the one thing I am absolutely certain of. He will never get near this child. How long have you been running? Callum asked. 6 months, she said. I left when I found out I was pregnant. I knew if I stayed... She stopped. Started again. I knew if I stayed I would not be able to protect the baby the way I hadn't been able to protect myself. So I took what I could carry and I got out. She gave a small, humorless smile. I'm very good at disappearing. I had a lot of practice. The weight of that landed hard. Callum leaned back in his chair and studied her for a long moment. There was a great deal he wanted to say, a great deal rising in him that was hot and dangerous and had nothing to do with the careful, measured reasoning he had spent 2 decades cultivating. He wanted to ask her for a name, a full name, a location, anything useful. He wanted to make several phone calls immediately. He did none of these things. Not yet. Not tonight. You're going to stop working the late shift, he said. She frowned. Mr. Brennan, Callum. Callum. She said it like it cost her something. I need the hours. The agency pays differently for nights. You're 8 months pregnant and climbing on step stools at midnight. That's done. His voice was quiet but final, the voice he used when a decision had been made and the conversation about it was over. I'll speak to Mrs. Doyle. She'll sort out your schedule. You can't just... I own the house, he said simply. I can. She stared at him. Something moved across her face that might have been frustration and might have been something much more fragile. Why are you doing this? She asked. Because you're Nola Ferris, he said. And when we were 9 years old, you snuck me half your lunch every day for a month because you figured out my mother had lost her job and I wasn't eating and you never told anyone, not once. He paused. I don't forget things like that. She looked away from him. She looked at the window, at the dark glass, at whatever she could see in it that was better than looking at him right now. Her throat moved. I forgot about that, she said softly. I didn't. The silence this time was different, softer at the edges. I'm going to be all right, she said, and he could hear in it that she was saying it as much to herself as to him. I just need a little more time and then I'll have enough saved up and I can... Nola. He said her name again gently this time and she stopped talking. You don't have to explain your plan to me. You don't have to justify anything. I'm just telling you that for as long as you're working in this house, you're going to be taken care of properly. That's all. She turned back to look at him. There was something terribly young in her face in that moment. Something underneath all the worn-down guardedness. Something that reminded him suddenly and sharply of the girl she had been. Okay, she said quietly. Okay, he agreed. She reached for the glass of water and drank from it, and he watched her and thought about 6 months of running, and 4 years before that, and the bruise shaped like fingers on her wrist. And he kept his face still and his hands loose and did not let any of what was moving through him reach the surface. Later, after she had gone back to her quarters and the house had gone fully quiet, Callum sat alone in his office with the bourbon misses. Doyle had poured him now warm and barely touched, and he stared at the wall and thought. He thought about Garrett, whose last name he did not yet have, but would have by morning. He thought about the particular and very specific kind of man who put his hands on a pregnant woman. He thought about 6 months of running about step stools at midnight, about bruises shaped like someone else's grip. He thought about the fact that Nola had worked in his house for 3 weeks and had never once given any indication that she knew him. She had kept her head down and her sleeves down and her eyes down the way a person kept everything down when keeping it down was how they survived. She had been right there in his house, and she had been invisible by design. He picked up his phone. He sent 1 text, 3 words to a number saved without a name. The response came back in under a minute. 2 words. Understood. Done. Callum set the phone down and finally drank the bourbon. He sat there for a long time after that in the quiet of the house that was too large for one person and always had been. And he thought about 9-year-old Nola Ferris tearing her sandwich in half without looking at him about it. The casual, fierce dignity of it. The way she had understood what he needed without making him ask. He thought about how some people were just made from something different, something that endured. He hoped she had some of it left. When he finally went to bed, it was close to 2 a.m. He lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling. He was not a man who had trouble sleeping. He had learned long ago to leave the day's business at the door of his bedroom to compartmentalize with a surgeon's precision. Tonight, the precision failed him. He kept seeing the bruise on her wrist. He kept hearing the way she had said bad enough flat and matter-of-fact and utterly devastating. He kept thinking about 6 months. 6 months of sleeping wherever she could sleep, working whatever she could work carrying a baby, and carrying that whole story alone, never telling anyone, never asking anyone, just enduring. He did not sleep until nearly 4. When he woke at 6, he had already decided 3 things. The first was that Nola Ferris was not going back on the late shift. The second was that she was not going to spend another night in the small damp room at the end of the East Corridor that the agency had arranged for her. The third was that before this week was out, he was going to know everything there was to know about a man named Garrett. He showered and dressed and went downstairs and found Mrs. Doyle in the kitchen already, because Mrs. Doyle was always already in the kitchen, and he told her calmly and clearly what he needed. She listened without interrupting, which was one of her finest qualities. "The young woman in room 12, he said, "the pregnant one. I want her moved to the South Guest Suite today." Mrs. Doyle raised an eyebrow. Just one very precisely. "That's quite an upgrade." "It has a private bath and a proper bed and windows that actually open," he said. "That's not an upgrade. That's a minimum." She studied him for a moment with the frank assessment of a woman who had known him for 8 years and had very few illusions about who he was. Then she nodded once. "I'll see to it this morning," she said. "And her schedule. She comes off nights, days only, and nothing that requires her to be on her feet for more than 3 hours at a stretch." "She's not going to like that," Mrs. Doyle said. "I've watched that one. She's proud. Works twice as hard as she needs to." "I know," Callum said. "Handle it carefully." Mrs. Doyle almost smiled. "I've been handling things carefully since before you were born, Mr. Brennan." He left her to it and went to his office and closed the door, and the first call he made was to a man named Declan, who was very good at finding things, and the second call he made was to his personal physician, who owed him a considerable favor and didn't ask questions. And by 8 o'clock he had set in motion everything he could set in motion from behind a desk. He did not see Nola that morning. He heard through Mrs. Doyle that she had accepted the room change with a combination of gratitude and suspicion that apparently manifested as trying to argue about it for 10 minutes before giving in. He almost smiled at that. He was walking through the house that afternoon, heading from one meeting to the next, when he turned a corner and nearly walked directly into her. She was carrying a basket of fresh linens because even on light duty, she apparently could not stop working, and she looked up at him with those watchful brown eyes, and there was a half second of something passing across her face before the wall came back up. "Sorry," she said. "Don't apologize," he said. An awkward beat. "The room is very nice," she said stiffly. "I want you to know I'll be out of it the moment the baby comes, and I've saved enough to get my own place." "I'm not trying to take advantage." "I know you're not," he said. "I just need you to know that." "Nola," he stopped, looked at her, said it quietly without impatience. "I know." She held the basket a little tighter. "Why does everyone in this house treat me like I'm made of glass all of a sudden?" "Because you're 8 months pregnant and working yourself to the bone," he said. "And because Mrs. Doyle is constitutionally incapable of not mothering people. And because I told her to keep an eye on you." He paused. "And because you are not made of glass. But that doesn't mean you don't deserve to be taken care of." She looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression. Something complicated. "You're different than I expected," she said finally. "Most people say I'm exactly what they expected, and worse," he said. "Most people don't know you," she said. And then she seemed to realize what she had said, and a faint color came into her face, and she looked down at the basket. "I should get back." "I'll see you at dinner," he said. "Mrs. Doyle sets a place for staff who want it, the kitchen table." She looked up. "You eat in the kitchen." "On Thursdays," he said. "It started as an accident and turned into a habit." He said it mildly as if it were nothing, and turned to continue down the hallway. Behind him he heard her say quietly, barely above a breath, "Okay?" He kept walking. But something in his chest, something behind the glass, where he kept the things that mattered, moved, just slightly, just enough for him to notice. That evening, for the first time in a very long time, Callum Brennan sat at a kitchen table with another person and ate dinner and talked about things that had nothing to do with power or money or the particular brutal architecture of the life he had built. They talked about South Boston in the 90s. They talked about a teacher they had both hated. They talked about a corner store that was probably a parking lot now. Nola ate carefully, deliberately, the way people ate when they had spent time not being sure where the next meal was coming from. She asked him nothing personal. She volunteered nothing heavy. She kept it light and easy, and so did he. And by the time Mrs. Doyle cleared the table and gave them both a look that said absolutely nothing, and everything something between them had shifted. Not much, just enough. Later, as Callum locked up his office for the night, Declan called. "Got your man," he said. "Garrett Hale, 37. Newark address, though he's been moving around. Got a sheet. 2 priors, both domestic. Both dropped when the complainant stopped cooperating." Declan paused. "You want me to keep digging?" "Everything," Callum said. "I want everything." "This personal." Callum looked out the window at the dark grounds, at the lights in the south wing where the guest suite was, where somewhere Nola Ferris was probably lying awake with her hand on her belly, talking quietly to a baby who didn't know yet how hard the world had worked to prevent her from existing. "Yeah," he said. "It's personal." He hung up and stood there in the dark for a moment, very still, very quiet, and let himself feel the full weight of what he was going to do. Garrett Hale had no idea yet that the world had just shifted under his feet. He would. The morning after their kitchen dinner, Callum was already on his 3rd cup of coffee when Declan walked into the office without knocking, which meant the news wasn't good. Declan was not a man who delivered bad news gently. He sat down across from Callum, set a manila folder on the desk, and said, "Garrett Hale is in the city." Callum set down his cup very carefully. "How close?" "Checked into a motel on Reardon Street 2 days ago." Declan paused. "That's 11 minutes from this house." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it, the kind you could press your hand against and feel pushing back. "He knows she's here?" Callum asked. "Don't think so. Not yet. He's been hitting her old contacts. Her former landlord in Providence, a woman she used to work with at the diner, her cousin in Quincy. He's building a trail." Declan leaned back. "He's patient. That's the type that worries me more than the loud ones." Callum opened the folder. He looked at the photograph clipped to the first page. Garrett Hale was average in every physical way that a person could be. Average medium height, medium build, the kind of face that wouldn't register in a crowd, the kind of man who was forgettable on purpose. Callum had known men like this his entire life. He understood them in the way that you understood a particular breed of predator, not with sympathy, but with the cold clarity of recognition. "Does she know he's looking?" Callum asked. "I haven't told her," Declan said. "Figured that was your call." Callum closed the folder. Double the watch on the east gate. I want someone on the grounds overnight, not just the cameras. He stood. And I want his full schedule. Where he goes when, who he talks to. Everything. Declan nodded and was halfway to the door when Callum said, "And Declan, nobody touches him yet." Declan turned. There was something questioning in his expression. "I need it done right," Callum said. "Not fast. Right." Declan left. Callum stood at his desk for a long moment with his hand flat on the closed folder, and then he picked up his phone and called Mrs. Doyle and told her he needed to speak with Nola before lunch, and that it should be arranged quietly, and that Nola should not be alarmed before he had a chance to talk to her himself. Mrs. Doyle said she would handle it. She always did. He found Nola in the south sitting room 40 minutes later, standing at the window with her arms crossed over her belly and her back slightly stiff in the way it got when she was bracing for something. She had learned somehow in the 2 weeks since she had come to the mansion to read the house's rhythms well enough that she already knew when something had changed. Callum found that both impressive and concerning. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me first," she said without turning around. "Nola, tell me first, and then I'll sit down." She turned then, and her face was composed and still in a way that cost her. He could see that he could see the effort behind it. "He found me, didn't he?" It wasn't a question. "He's in the city," Callum said. "He doesn't know you're here, but he's looking." She nodded, once short and tight. She sat down on the edge of the armchair and put both hands flat on her knees and stared at a point on the floor between them, and for a moment she just breathed. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay," he repeated. "I knew he would come." She said it quietly. "I knew it the whole time. I was just hoping I was wrong." She looked up at him. "How much time do I have?" "Enough," he said. "He's working off old information. His trail goes through Providence, not Boston." He pulled a chair close and sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, because he wanted her to see his face when he said the next part. "I need you to listen to me very carefully, Nola. You are not going to run. Not this time." Something moved through her expression. Not relief, not quite. Something more complicated than relief. "You don't know what he's like," she said. "I know exactly what he's like. Callum, he has—" She stopped herself, started again. "He has a gun. He had 2 when I left. He keeps one in his car and one in the apartment. He's told me more than once that he would—" She pressed her lips together. "He's not the kind of person who makes empty threats." "Neither am I," Callum said. She looked at him for a long time. She was reading him the way she read everything in this house, carefully and thoroughly, looking for the lie or the catch or the cost. He let her look. He had nothing to hide from her on this particular subject. "You can't just—" she began. "Nola, I have 12 men on this property. I have people who have been tracking Garrett Hale's movements for 36 hours. I have the resources to keep you safe in ways that running never could." He said it plainly, not to impress her, just because it was true, and she needed to hear it clearly. "But I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" The question hung there between them. She looked down at her hands on her knees. "The last person I trusted said he would take care of me too," she said softly. The words landed like something dropped from a great height. "I know," Callum said. "Callum." And he did not say anything else because there was nothing else to say that would undo that history or rush past it or paper over it with promises. He just let her sit with it and let himself sit with it, and he waited. "What do you need from me?" she finally asked. "Don't go outside the property line, not until this is resolved." He held her gaze. "That's all. Just stay inside the fence." "And if it's not resolved quickly?" "It will be," he said. Then because she deserved honesty more than comfort. "But if it takes longer than it should, we'll adjust. You won't be a prisoner here, Nola. You'll just be safe." She exhaled slowly. The tension in her shoulders shifted, not disappeared, but redistributed into something she could carry more evenly. "Okay," she said again. "Okay," he agreed. That same afternoon, Mrs. Doyle appeared in the doorway of the South Guest Suite while Nola was folding laundry, which she was doing because she could not seem to stop working, even when explicitly given permission to rest, and informed her that Dr. Shea would be arriving at 4 o'clock for a prenatal checkup and that Nola was to be ready and not to argue about it. Nola argued about it for 6 minutes, which Mrs. Doyle later reported to Callum with something approaching admiration. Dr. Shea was a compact, efficient woman in her 50s who examined Nola with thorough professionalism and spoke to her plainly and without condescension, which Nola responded to the way parched ground responded to rain, with a kind of desperate, barely concealed relief. Afterward, finding Callum in his office, Dr. Shea told him that the baby was healthy and positioned well, and that Nola was in the late stages of her 8th month, that her iron was low, and she was mildly dehydrated and showing signs of chronic stress that were not going to do her any favors in labor. "She needs rest," Dr. Shea said. "Real rest, not the kind where you lie down and your mind runs laps." "I know," Callum said. "She's tough," Dr. Shea said, with something that was professional and personal all at once. "But tough isn't a substitute for safe. Keep her calm. Keep her still." After the doctor left, Callum sat in his office with the file on Garrett Hale open on his desk, and he thought about what keeping Nola calm actually required. He thought about the way she had sat across from him that morning, with her hands flat on her knees, absorbing the information that the man who had broken her wrists and her ribs, and God knows what else, was 11 minutes away and still hunting. And she had said, "Okay," twice, with that terrible, controlled steadiness. He thought about what it took to become a person who responded to terror with okay. He picked up his phone and called Declan again. "I want him gone," Callum said. "Not just watched, gone, but it has to be clean, nothing that comes back." Declan was quiet for a moment. "That's a different operation." "I know what it is," Callum said. "Set it in motion, but wait for my word before anyone moves." "Understood." He hung up. He sat back. He was not a man who struggled with decisions like this one. He had made decisions like this one many times for many reasons, and he had learned to live with them, the way you learn to live with old injuries, aware of them, accommodated to them, but no longer stopped by them. What he felt now was not conflict. It was something more like clarity. There was a knock at his office door. He closed the folder. "Come in." It was Nola. She stood in the doorway in a way that was not quite entering and not quite retreating, with that watchful quality she had, that constant, low-level alertness that probably never fully switched off. "Dr. Shea said to thank you," she said, "for arranging it." "You don't have to relay her thanks. I'll hear them directly next time I see her." "I know," she paused. "I'm saying thank you. From me. For that and the room and the—" She made a small, frustrated gesture with one hand. "All of it. I'm not good at this." "At what?" "At receiving things without giving something back," she said. "It makes me feel like I owe something, and I don't know what it is, and I don't like not knowing." He almost smiled. "You don't owe me anything." "People always say that," she said, and it came out a little bitter around the edges, not directed at him exactly, but pointed at something in her history that was still close enough to cut. "Come in and sit down," he said. She came in. She sat. She did it on the settee across from his desk, this time, not the edge of it, but actually back against the cushion, which was progress he decided not to remark on. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Why do you have 12 men on this property?" She said it evenly, without judgment in her voice, but with genuine curiosity. "What is it that you actually do?" The question was direct and inevitable, and he had been expecting it in some form since the first night. He looked at her for a moment, deciding not how much to say, but how to say it, because Nola Ferris was sharp and had been surviving difficult truths her whole life, and she deserved a real answer. "I run things," he said. "Businesses, operations. Some of them are completely legal, some of them are not." He let that sit. "I'm not going to dress it up." She nodded slowly. "Are you dangerous?" "Yes," he said, "to the right people. And I'm not one of the right people." "Nola," he said it gently, "you are the furthest possible thing from the right people." She looked at her hands in her lap. Something in her expression was working through something. "I don't know if I should be scared of you or grateful to you," she said quietly. "You can be both," he said, "but I'd prefer just grateful." She made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. It surprised her he could see that, like her own body had done something without permission. "You were always strange," she said. "Even as a kid, you used to walk around the neighborhood like you were already the oldest person there." "I was the oldest person there," he said. "Someone had to be." She looked at him, then really looked at him, and there was something in it that was tender and sad and clear-eyed all at once. Did it ever stop, the having to be? The question went somewhere he hadn't expected. He held her gaze for a moment. "Not really," he admitted. She nodded, like she understood, like maybe she had spent her own years being older than she should have had to be. Like that was something they had in common, something that had run parallel in their separate lives all this time without either of them knowing it. It was Mrs. Doyle who interrupted them, arriving with tea and a plate of food. She sat in front of Nola without ceremony, saying only, "Doctor's orders, eat something that isn't from a vending machine," and then leaving with the efficiency of a woman who had been managing households and the people in them for half a century. Nola ate. Callum watched the house settle around them in the early evening quiet. "Tell me something good," she said unexpectedly around a bite of bread. "Tell me something good that happened to you. I've been telling you all my disasters." He thought about it genuinely. "I bought the house 3 years ago from a man who told me someone like me would never know what to do with a place like this." "What did you say to him?" "I said that was probably true, and I handed him a check and shook his hand," Callum said. "And then I spent 6 months making it exactly what I wanted it to be." "What did you want it to be?" He paused. It was a longer pause than he intended. "Somewhere that felt like it was mine," he said finally. "Not borrowed, not temporary. Mine." Nola was quiet for a moment. "That doesn't sound like a small thing," she said softly. "No," he agreed. "It wasn't." The evening moved on. Nola went to bed early on Dr. Shea's instruction and Callum's quiet insistence. He walked the grounds after she went in, speaking briefly with the 2 overnight men he had posted near the perimeter, and then he went back inside and sat at his desk with a glass of bourbon and his phone reading the updates Declan sent every few hours. Garrett Hale had spent the afternoon at a bar on Commonwealth Avenue. He had made 3 calls, 2 to numbers that turned out to be disconnected former associates of Nola's, and 1 to a private investigator Declan's people were now looking into. He had eaten alone. He had gone back to his motel at 9:15. He was still there. Callum read the reports twice. He thought about the private investigator. That was a complication he hadn't anticipated, and it changed the timeline. He sent Declan a message. "How fast can we move?" The response took 4 minutes. 48 hours if you say go." Callum stared at his phone. He thought about Nola asleep down the hall with her hand on her belly and 11 days give or take until her due date. He thought about the private investigator and what that meant for how quickly Garrett's trail could lead here. He typed, "Get ready, wait for my word." He set the phone down. He was halfway to the door when it buzzed on the desk. He turned back. It was Declan again, but it wasn't the message he expected. It was 3 words he talked. "Investigator." And then 4 seconds later, a follow-up. "She's been mentioned. The Brennan estate. He has a name, Callum." Callum stood very still in the middle of his office for exactly 4 seconds. Then he sat back down. Then he picked up the phone and called Declan directly. "Tell me everything," he said. "PI's been busy," Declan said. "He made calls this afternoon while Hale was at the bar, cross-referenced the cleaning agency's placements, got lucky. Hale knows she's somewhere connected to your address." A pause. "He doesn't have the exact property confirmed, but he's close, Callum. He's close enough." "Move up the timeline," Callum said. 24 hours. "Good. And Declan." His voice was very quiet now, the kind of quiet that in his world was louder than shouting. "Make sure it's airtight. I don't want anything loose." "You have my word." He hung up. He sat in the silence. He thought about Nola's face when she said the last person who said they'd take care of her. He thought about her hands on her knees. He thought about "okay," said twice with all that controlled terror underneath it. He was not going to let Garrett Hale get within a mile of this house. He was not going to let Nola run again. He had spent 20 years building something powerful, something that could reach into situations and resolve them in ways that the law moved too slowly to touch, and he had never once in all that time used it for something that felt this necessary. Not just right. Necessary. The way breathing was necessary. The way keeping someone alive was necessary. He stood up. He walked down the hall to the south guest suite, and he stood outside the closed door and listened and heard nothing, which meant she was sleeping, which was what she needed. And he stood there for a moment in the dark corridor, feeling the full weight of what the next 24 hours required. Then he turned around and went back to work. At just past midnight, Mrs. Doyle found him still at his desk and set a cup of tea down beside him without a word, and turned off the overhead light and left him with just the desk lamp, because she had been doing things like that for 8 years, and she understood without being told when he needed the room dimmed but not dark. He was reading through Garrett Hale's prior domestic charges. Both of them. The first victim had been a woman named Caroline, 28, who had filed and then retracted within 6 days. The second was a woman named Sandra, 31, 18 months ago. Same pattern, same retraction faster this time. The system had touched this man twice, and both times he had slipped right through it. Callum thought about those two women. He thought about whether they were still running, or whether they had found some version of still. He thought about Nola being the third. He closed the file. At 1 a.m, his phone buzzed with a different kind of update, not from Declan, but from the overnight man on the east perimeter. A car had driven slowly past the property gate twice in the past 40 minutes. Dark sedan, partial plate that matched the rental Garrett Hale had picked up at Logan 3 days ago. Callum read the message once. He typed back, "Hold position, do not engage, watch only." He put the phone in his pocket. He stood up. He walked to the window and stood in the dark and looked out at the gate and the quiet road beyond it. And somewhere out there in a dark car, a man who had put his boot into a pregnant woman's ribs was driving in slow circles looking for her. His hands were very still at his sides. His face was very still. But behind the stillness, something old and absolute and entirely decided had settled into place in him like a key turning in a lock. 24 hours. He turned away from the window and went back to his desk, and he sat down and he began to make the calls that would close every exit Garrett Hale had left. He didn't sleep that night. Not a single hour. By 6 a.m, Callum had spoken to Declan 4 times, reviewed the overnight reports twice, and consumed enough coffee that Mrs. Doyle, who arrived at 6:30, to find him already at his desk, with the look of a man who had been running calculations in his head all night, set down a glass of water next to the coffee cup without comment, and gave him a look that said everything she was too professional to say out loud. "She's still asleep," Mrs. Doyle said, meaning Nola, because that was the real question under every other question in this house right now. "Good," Callum said. "Let her sleep as long as she needs." "The car came past again at 3, Mrs. Doyle said. "I saw it from my window." He looked up at her. "You were awake at 3. "I'm always awake at 3, she said with the mild indignation of someone stating an obvious fact. "I'm 68 years old. Nobody sleeps at 3. She straightened the already straight papers on the edge of his desk. "He's getting braver, driving slower each time." "I know." "Then do what you need to do," she said quietly. "And do it today." She left. Callum sat with that for a moment, because Mrs. Doyle had worked for him for 8 years and had never once said anything like that, had maintained a careful and mutual policy of her not acknowledging what he was, and him not requiring her to. The fact that she had said it now plainly without flinching told him more about the situation than any of Declan's reports had. Even Mrs. Doyle could feel the clock running down. He picked up his phone and called Declan. "Move it up," he said. "Don't wait for tonight. Do it now." A pause. "It's 6 a.m. "I know what time it is." Another pause shorter. "Understood. Give me 3 hours." "You have 2. He hung up. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling and breathed through it the way he had trained himself to breathe through the moments before things became irreversible. Because once Declan moved, it was irreversible. That was the nature of it. You decided, and then you lived with the decision, and you did not spend time afterward asking whether it was the right one, because the asking didn't change the outcome and it didn't serve the living. He had always been good at that, the living with it. He was thinking about whether he was still good at it when he heard the sound. It was faint. Down the hall. A sharp intake of breath, then nothing, and then the sound of something heavy shifting, and then nothing again. He was out of his chair before he fully registered that he was moving. He knocked once on the guest suite door and pushed it open without waiting. Nola was standing in the middle of the room with one hand gripping the bedpost and the other flat against her belly, and her face was the color of old ash. She looked at him when he came in, and what was in her eyes was not the careful, guarded watchfulness he had come to know. It was something rawer than that. "I think," she said with extraordinary, almost absurd calm, "that something is happening." "The baby," he said. "The baby," she confirmed. He crossed the room in 4 steps. "How long have you been having contractions?" "I'm not sure they're contractions." She exhaled slow and deliberate through her mouth. "It started about an hour ago. I thought it would stop." "It didn't stop." "Clearly not." "Why didn't you call for someone?" he asked, and heard the edge in his own voice and pulled it back. This was not the moment for that. "Because I didn't want to be dramatic," she said, and then another wave of whatever it was moved through her, and her knuckles went white on the bedpost, and she stopped talking for a moment and just breathed. When it passed, she said without looking at him, "That one was stronger." He already had his phone out. He called Dr. Shea directly. She answered on the second ring, and he gave her the information in clean, quick sentences, and she told him she would be there in 20 minutes, and told him exactly what to do until she arrived, and he listened and confirmed and hung up. "She's coming," he told Nola. "She's going to tell me I'm not ready yet and send me to walk laps around the house," Nola said, with the slightly desperate humor of a person trying to hold themselves together through something that was rapidly exceeding their capacity to control. "Maybe," Callum said, "but she's coming either way." He pulled the chair from the corner and set it behind her, and she sat down in it heavily, still holding the bedpost, and he crouched down to her eye level in a way that felt entirely unnatural to him, because Callum Brennan was not a man who crouched down for anyone and looked at her directly. "You're okay," he said. "You don't know that." "I know you," he said. "That's close enough." She looked at him. For a moment, her composure fractured slightly, just at the edges, just enough that he could see what was underneath it, which was terror. Not of the labor, but of everything surrounding it. Of doing this without the safety net that mothers were supposed to have, of the fact that somewhere 11 minutes away, a man who wanted to destroy her was in a motel room, and now she was about to be in no condition to run. "Garrett," she said. The name came out like a held breath finally released. "Is being handled," Callum said. "Right now, as we sit here." "Callum, Nola, look at me." He waited until she did. "Your only job today is this baby. Everything else is mine. Do you understand me?" She held his gaze. He watched her make the decision. Not the easy decision, not the natural decision for someone who had been handling everything alone for 6 months, but the necessary one. "Okay," she said. 3rd time she had said that word to him, and each time it had cost her something different. "Okay," he agreed. Dr. Shea arrived in 18 minutes. She came through the front door with a bag over her shoulder and the brisk authority of someone who had delivered over 300 babies and treated panic as a personal affront. She examined Nola efficiently and thoroughly, and then stood up and said with the matter-of-fact warmth that was entirely her own, "You are absolutely in labor. You are also only 5 centimeters dilated, which means we have time, but we are not sending you to walk laps." "I told him that," Nola said, pointing at Callum. "He's a smart man," Dr. Shea said, already moving to her bag. "He knows when to call." Callum stepped out of the room to give them space and stood in the hallway with his phone in his hand and his back against the wall, and let himself have exactly 30 seconds of feeling everything that was moving through him, which was a great deal more than he usually permitted. Then he straightened up and called Declan. "Update," he said. "We're in motion," Declan said. "Hale left the motel 40 minutes ago. He's moving toward the north end of the city. We have 3 cars on him." "What's his direction?" "East." "Could be nothing. Could be he's circling." A pause. "Could be the PI gave him something more specific overnight." "Is he armed?" Almost certainly. Gun was spotted in the car at the motel parking lot. Our guy had a clear visual. Callum pressed the back of his head against the wall and looked at the ceiling, armed in motion, possibly with better information than he had yesterday. And in the guest suite, 20 feet away, a woman was in labor. "Don't let him get within half a mile," Callum said. "I don't care what it takes to redirect him, but do not let him reach this street." "Already on it," Declan said. "We've got a roadblock we can activate at the intersection on Linwood. Traffic issue, construction. He won't get through." "Do it." "Done." He hung up. He stayed in the hallway. Through the door, he could hear Dr. Shay's voice low and steady, and Nola's voice answering, and he found himself listening for the particular sound of Nola not panicking, of Nola holding herself together the way she always held herself together, with that terrible, disciplined stillness. He heard her breathing through something measured and controlled, and then her voice rough at the edges. "Is it supposed to hurt this much?" And Dr. Shay dry and kind in equal measure. "Yes, unambiguously yes. Anyone who told you otherwise was lying to protect someone's feelings." A sound from Nola that was almost a laugh. Just almost. Callum went to find Mrs. Doyle. He found her in the kitchen, already boiling water and cutting towels into strips with the calm efficiency of a woman who had been anticipating this moment all morning, possibly longer. She looked up when he came in. "How far along?" she asked. 5 centimeters. Dr. Shay says hours yet." "First babies always take their time, Mrs." Doyle said. She set down the scissors. "And Garrett Hale, being handled." She looked at him with those sharp eyes that had watched him for 8 years and missed very little. "Are you all right?" she asked. The question surprised him, not because it was the wrong question, but because it was so precisely the right one. "Ask me again tonight," he said. She nodded, satisfied with that, and turned back to the stove. He went back to the hallway. His phone buzzed. Declan. He answered immediately. "We have a problem," Declan said. His chest tightened. "Tell me." The roadblock worked. He stopped, turned around, went back the way he came. "But Callum..." A pause that lasted half a second too long. "He didn't go back to the motel." "Where did he go?" "He's at the cleaning agency," Declan said. "Downtown office. He walked in 20 minutes ago and he's still in there. The cleaning agency, the company that had placed Nola in this house, the company that had her address on file." "How fast can you get someone inside?" Callum asked, and his voice had gone to that particular register that the people who worked for him had learned to recognize as the one that meant stop calculating and start moving. "I've got a man outside right now," Declan said. "But if we go in, it's visible. Messy." "Is there another way to get the information before he does?" Declan was quiet for 2 seconds. "The office manager, woman named Linda Chu. She's been on our payroll for 6 months. She processes background checks for us. She picks up the phone when I call." "Call her," Callum said. "Right now, while he's sitting in the waiting room or wherever he is. Tell her that under no circumstances does she give him anything. Tell her that if she does, she'll have a problem that makes whatever Garrett Hale is offering her look like a minor inconvenience. And if he pressures her, tell her to stall. Tell her the files are being audited. Tell her the system is down. Anything." He thought fast. "And get someone into that building, not to engage, just to watch what happens and be ready if it goes sideways." "Moving now," Declan said. Callum stood in the hallway for a moment with the phone pressed to his sternum and the sound of Nola breathing through contractions 20 feet away, and he thought about the fact that his entire operation was currently being run simultaneously with a woman going into labor in his guest suite, and he thought that this was not a situation any contingency plan had covered. Then he straightened up and went back into the room because Dr. Shay had called his name. Nola was sitting up on the bed, and she was pale and sweating slightly, and her hair was loose around her face, and she looked at him when he came in with an expression that was complicated and very honest. "I need to tell you something," she said, "in case today goes sideways." "It's not going sideways," Dr. Shay said, not looking up from what she was doing. "In case," Nola said, still looking at Callum, "I need you to know that when I came to this house, I was not planning to stay. I was not planning to need anyone. And I need you to know that whatever happens with Garrett, whatever happens today, you changed something for me. Just by..." She stopped. Just by being what you are, what you've been this past 2 weeks. Callum crossed the room and pulled the chair to her bedside and sat in it and said nothing because there was nothing to say that wouldn't make it smaller than it was. I spent 4 years being told I was nothing, she said, and 6 months telling myself that was a lie. And then I walked into this house and you looked at me like I was Nola Ferris from South Boston, and that's... Her voice cracked just once, then held. That mattered more than you know. I know, he said. You can't know. I know, he said again quietly, and this time she didn't argue. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He looked at Nola. She made a small impatient gesture with her hand. Answer it. It's about him. He stepped outside the door. Tell me, he said. Declan's voice was tight. Linda held him, told him system maintenance, nothing she could access. He got angry, raised his voice. She held her ground. He left. A breath. But Callum, on the way out he made a call. Our guy got close enough to hear part of it. He said he had the street name. He has the street name. Everything in Callum went absolutely quiet. He has the street, he repeated. Linwood, he said Linwood. He doesn't have the house number yet, but with 12 houses on that street, it won't take him long to narrow it down. Declan's voice dropped. He's coming, Callum. Probably within the hour. Callum turned and looked at the closed door of the guest suite. He thought about Nola behind it, 8 centimeters dilated by now, or close to it, unable to run, unable to hide, entirely dependent on what happened in the next 60 minutes. Lock it down, he said. Full lockdown. Gates secured everyone on the perimeter. No movement in or out without my direct approval. Nobody gets to this door. You understand me? Nobody. Already calling it in, Declan said. And Callum, do you want me to activate the other option? The other option was not something they discussed explicitly on the phone. Callum had put it in place 3 years ago for situations where a threat required permanent resolution before it reached a critical threshold. He had never used it. He had hoped never to need it. Not yet, he said. Position it, but not yet. I want this done legally if there's a path. There might be one, Declan said, and his voice shifted in a way that made Callum's attention sharpen. Talk to me. The 2 prior victims, Caroline and Sandra, our research team reached out to both yesterday. Quietly. Carefully. He paused. Sandra wants to talk. She's been wanting to talk for 18 months. She just needed someone to tell her she'd be safe first. Callum closed his eyes for 1 second. Opened them. Set it up. Get her on record. Full statement, everything video, if she'll consent. She already consented, Declan said. She's been ready. She just needed a reason. Nola is her reason, Callum said. Tell her that. Tell her there's a 3rd woman and she's in labor right now and she needs this to end today. Silence on the line. Then quietly, that'll do it. I know, Callum said. He went back into the room. Doctor. Shay looked up at him over Nola's head and held up 8 fingers. 8 centimeters. Getting close. Nola had her eyes closed and was breathing with the focused intensity of someone converting pain into something manageable through sheer willpower, which was Callum thought the most Nola thing he had ever witnessed. Still here, he said quietly. I noticed, she said without opening her eyes. He sat back down in the chair. His phone was in his hand and his attention was split between the woman in the bed and the situation converging on the street outside, and he held both of them the way he had always held multiple critical situations, with a kind of compartmentalized focus that kept each thing in its own space without letting them bleed into each other. Then his phone buzzed with a message from his perimeter man, and the compartmentalization cracked. Dark sedan, Linwood, stopped outside gate. Driver is out of the car. Callum stood up. He stepped to the door. Mrs. Doyle, he called with the precise volume that carried without alarming. She appeared immediately from the hallway because Mrs. Doyle always appeared immediately when she was needed, and he said to her quietly, I need you to stay in this room. Don't leave for any reason until I come back. She looked at his face and read it accurately. Go, she said. I've got her. He moved through the house fast, not running because running sent the wrong signal to the wrong people, but with the economy of motion of a man who knew exactly where he was going and what he intended to do when he arrived. He went to the front entrance, pulled the panel beside the door that controlled the gate feed, and looked at the screen. Garrett Hale was standing on the sidewalk outside the Brennan estate gate with his hands in his jacket pockets and his face tilted up, reading the number on the gate post. Just standing there, reading the number, confirming what he already suspected. He looked smaller on the screen than Callum had expected, more ordinary. That was always the thing that surprised people, how ordinary the worst ones looked, how unremarkably they moved through the world until they didn't. Callum pressed the intercom button on the panel, opened a channel to the two gatemen. "Hold position," he said. "Do not engage. Let him stand there." Then he called Declan. "He's at the gate." "I see him," Declan said. "We're watching." "And Sandra, on the phone with our lawyer right now," Declan said. "Statement will be filed within the hour. I've also got a contact at the DA's office who owes us a favor. If the statement is solid, and it is solid, Callum, this woman has dates, photographs, medical records. They can move on an arrest warrant today." "Today," Callum repeated. "Before tonight. If I push every button I've got, yes." "Push them," Callum said. He watched the screen. Garrett Hale stood outside the gate for 43 seconds, which Callum counted. Then he took out his phone and made a call. Then he put his phone away and looked at the gate for another moment. Then he got back in his car. Callum's hand on the panel was very still. He watched the car. It didn't move for almost a full minute. Then the engine started, and the car pulled away from the curb and moved down Linwood Street and turned at the end and was gone. He exhaled through his nose. He did not move for another 30 seconds, watching the empty street on the screen. His phone rang. "Declan." "He's heading back toward the motel," Declan said. "We've got 2 cars on him." "Don't lose him." "We won't." A pause. "He'll be back, Callum. He's going to regroup and come back." "He won't get the chance," Callum said. He put the phone in his pocket and turned and walked back through the house, fast and purposeful, back down the hallway toward the guest suite. And he was nearly to the door when he heard a sound from inside the room that stopped him cold for exactly 1 second. Not a sound of pain, not exactly. Something else. Something that he had no reference for in his life, which had contained a great deal, but not this. Mrs. Doyle opened the door. Her face was different, softer than he had ever seen it, and her eyes were bright, and she looked at him and said with the absolute simplicity of someone conveying the most important information of the day, "She's very close." He went in. Nola was beyond conversation now, beyond the careful, controlled composure, beyond everything except the enormous physical work of what her body was doing, and Dr. Shea was at the foot of the bed saying things in a low, steady voice, and Mrs. Doyle moved to the other side and took Nola's hand, and Nola gripped it with the force of everything she had been holding all this time, all 6 months, all 4 years, maybe longer. Callum stood at the side of the room, and he did not look away. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He took it out and read the message without moving. Warrant issued. Garrett Hale. Domestic violence assault, 2 prior charges reopened. Police moving to motel now. He read it twice. He put the phone back in his pocket. He stood in the room where Nola Ferris was about to bring a new life into the world, and outside on a street 11 minutes away, the man who had tried to end both of them was about to be met by forces that were moving faster than he could run, and for the first time since 1 o'clock the previous morning, Callum Brennan felt something in his chest loosen by a single precise degree. Not relief, not yet, but the first small breath before relief. The room held everything then, the past and the present and whatever was coming next, and Callum held all of it with it still and ready, the way he had learned to hold things that mattered. And then cutting through everything else in the room, there was a new sound. The sound was small and furious and entirely new to the world. It lasted only a few seconds before Dr. Shea's hands and voice took over, efficient and warm, managing the transition from one state of existence to another, with the practiced grace of someone who had witnessed it hundreds of times and still clearly had not become numb to it. Mrs. Doyle made a sound that was not quite a word, and Nola, who had been beyond language for the past 20 minutes, said something that was barely above a breath, a single syllable soft and broken open in the best possible way. Callum stood at the side of the room and did not move and did not speak, and felt something happen in his chest that he had no category for and did not try to name. Dr. Shea looked up after a moment and said, 7 pounds 2 ounces I'd estimate. Loud, good color, everything exactly where it should be. She said it to Nola, but her eyes flicked briefly to Callum, and in them was a message that was entirely human and entirely clear. It's done. She's here. They're both here. Let me see her, Nola said, and her voice was wrecked and raw and more alive than Callum had ever heard it. Doctor. Shea placed the baby against Nola's chest, and Nola's arms came around her with the absolute certainty of something that had been rehearsed for 8 months in every quiet moment and every frightened one, and she looked down at her daughter, and her face did something that Callum had to look away from. Not because it was wrong to witness, but because it was so completely private that even being in the same room felt like standing too close to something sacred. He looked at the wall. He breathed carefully. He put his hand in his pocket where his phone was and thought about the message he had received 11 minutes ago, warrant issued, police moving, and he held that information in him like something warm. She's perfect, Nola said, barely audible. She absolutely is, Dr. Shea confirmed. Mrs. Doyle, who had been silently crying for the past 4 minutes, in the careful way of someone who considered open weeping unprofessional, pressed a handkerchief to her face and said, with remarkable composure given the circumstances, "I'll put the kettle on," and left the room. Callum turned back. Nola was looking at him now over the top of her daughter's head with an expression that contained more things than he could count. Gratitude was in it, but it was not the surface thing. Underneath the gratitude was something older and more fundamental, the look of someone who had survived something that should have killed them and was only now, in this moment, beginning to fully understand that they had made it. "Callum," she said. "Yeah," he said. "She's here." "She's here?" he agreed. A pause. Then quietly, "Is he gone?" He crossed the room and sat in the chair beside the bed and leaned forward and said it plainly the way she always wanted things said. "The warrant was issued 40 minutes ago. Police are at his motel right now. Sandra, one of the women from before she gave a full statement. Medical records, photographs, dates. It was airtight." He held her gaze. "He's not coming back." Nola looked at him for a long moment. Her daughter made a small impatient sound against her chest, and Nola's hand moved automatically to the baby's back, a slow, steady circle. "Sandra," she repeated softly. "I didn't know about Sandra." "There was also a woman named Caroline," Callum said. "Before her." Something moved through Nola's face. "He told me I was the only one who ever made him angry enough to—" She stopped. The sentence didn't need finishing. "That's what they do, isn't it? They make you think it's specific to you." "Yes," Callum said. "They do." She looked down at her daughter. "She will never hear that," she said with a quiet ferocity that was more absolute than anything shouted. "Not one word of it. Not one version of it. Never." "No," Callum said. "She won't." His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Declan. He stood and stepped to the doorway. "He's in custody," Declan said without preamble. "Walked right into it, came back to the motel to get his second gun, and they had 4 units waiting. He didn't even run." A pause that had something dark and satisfied in it. "The look on his face when they read the charges, Callum. Sandra's statement, plus the 2 prior charges reopened. DA is talking about aggravated assault, stalking, unlawful possession. He's not going to see daylight for a very long time." Callum stood in the doorway between the hallway and the room and held the phone to his ear and felt the last of the tension in his body do something it rarely did. Release. Not completely, never completely, but enough. "Good," he said. "Clean it up. Make sure the documentation is solid, nothing that can be challenged. I want this conviction to stick." "Already handled," Declan said. "And Callum the baby." "Girl," Callum said. "She's here. She's good." A beat on the line. Declan, who was not a sentimental man by any measure, said quietly, "Good. That's good," and hung up. Callum put the phone away and stood in the doorway for a moment. "Doctor." Shea was finishing up with quiet efficiency, and Nola was doing what new mothers did in those first private minutes, learning the specific weight and warmth and reality of a person who had not existed in the world until 40 minutes ago. He went back to the chair and sat down without being asked, because nobody asked him to stay and nobody asked him to leave, and somehow that felt exactly right. "What are you going to name her?" he asked. Nola was quiet for a moment. "I've been going back and forth for 3 months," she said. "I had a list, 6 names. I looked at them every night." She looked down at her daughter. "Now, I'm looking at her, and none of them are right." She was quiet again. Then softly, "My grandmother's name was Josephine. She was the toughest person I ever knew. Raised 5 kids alone, never complained once, never asked anyone for anything." She touched the baby's face with one finger feather light. "She would have liked this one, I think." "Josephine," Callum said. He tried the weight of it. "Joe," Nola said. "Eventually, when she earns it." He almost smiled. "She's 40 minutes old." "I know. I'm giving her some time." This time, he did smile. He couldn't help it. It came up without permission, the way things did around Nola, the way she had always had that particular ability to catch him off guard. She looked at him when he smiled, and something shifted in her face. "I haven't seen you do that before," she said. "Do what?" "Actually smile, not the other kind." "What other kind?" "The one you use when you're in a room and you want people to think you're accessible," she said, matter of fact. "You have that one down very well. It doesn't reach your eyes." He said nothing, because she was entirely correct, and they both knew it. "This one reaches your eyes," she said, and looked back at Josephine. The house settled around them into a kind of quiet that was different from its nighttime quiet, softer. Mrs. Doyle came back with tea she set on the bedside table and looked at the baby with an expression that she quickly reassembled into professionalism. Dr. Shea gave instructions in her clear, practical way, feeding schedule, sleep, pain management, when to call, what to watch for, and Nola listened with the focused attention of someone who was going to memorize every word and would not need to be told twice. When Dr. Shea left, she paused at the door and looked at Callum. "She needs rest," she said. "Real rest. Probably 12 hours of it." "I know," Callum said. "Make sure she gets it," Dr. Shea said, with a look that was professionally neutral and personally pointed. After she was gone, the room was quiet. Josephine had fallen asleep against her mother's chest with the total unconscious confidence of someone who had decided the world was acceptable so far. Nola's eyes were heavy, but fighting it. "You should sleep," Callum said. "I know," she said, not moving. "Nola, She stopped, started again. "For 6 months, I slept with one ear open, every single night. Not once did I fall asleep without checking the locks first, without planning the exit route, without—" She exhaled. "I don't know how to turn that off. I don't know if I remember how." "You don't have to turn it off tonight," he said. "Tonight, I'll be the one with one ear open. You don't have to carry both, just for tonight." She looked at him. There was something in her face that was fragile, in a way she rarely permitted herself to be. "That is a very large thing to offer someone," she said softly. "I'm aware," he said. "Why?" she asked. "And don't say because I gave you half my sandwich when we were 9. You've more than repaid that." He thought about the question seriously, the way she deserved it to be taken seriously. "Because you came into my house like a ghost," he said. 3 weeks of being invisible. Working twice as hard as you needed, to staying out of everyone's way, never asking for a thing. And when I found you, your first instinct was to tell me you hadn't broken anything." He paused. "You have been so careful for so long not to cost anyone anything. And that's not—" He stopped. "You're allowed to cost something, Nola. You're allowed to take up space. You always were." She pressed her lips together hard. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then back at him, and the composure that had held through 6 months of running and a full day of labor and Garrett's arrest and a new baby was very thin right now, very thin and very honest. "I don't know how to do this," she said quietly. "Any of it. I don't know how to be someone who has help." "You start with tonight," he said, "and then tomorrow is its own thing." She looked at him for a long moment. Josephine shifted slightly against her chest, and Nola's hand moved automatically to steady her. "Okay," she said. 4th time. "Okay," he said. He stayed in the chair after she fell asleep, which took less than 10 minutes, the exhaustion finally overcoming the vigilance. He stayed for another hour after that, watching the room, listening to the house's phone on his knee with the screen dark. Declan sent 2 more updates, both clean, both confirming the same thing. Garrett Hale was in county lockup awaiting arraignment. The DA's office was moving aggressively on the charges. Sandra's testimony had done what years of restraint had not. At some point, Mrs. Doyle appeared in the doorway and looked at the sleeping woman and the sleeping baby and the very awake man in the chair and said nothing. She simply left a fresh cup of tea on the table by the door and went back to her own business. Callum picked it up without looking away from the room and drank it and thought about all of it. He thought about the private investigator who had nearly given Garrett the address. He thought about Linda Chu at the cleaning agency, who had held her ground under pressure and stalled long enough. He thought about Sandra, who had been ready for 18 months and just needed a reason. He thought about the way systems failed people, and the ways that other things smaller and more personal sometimes caught them when the systems dropped them. He thought about a 9-year-old girl tearing a sandwich in half without fanfare. He stayed until the light through the window shifted from the dark blue of very early morning to the pale gray of actual morning, and then he went quietly to the door and left without waking anyone. He went to his office. He sat down. He had 17 messages he hadn't answered and 4 meetings scheduled before noon. He looked at them. Then he called his assistant and moved everything to the afternoon and sat back and did something he almost never did, which was nothing. Just sat with the morning coming in and the house quiet and the knowledge of what the last 24 hours had contained. At 9:15, Declan called. "Arraignment is scheduled for 2 this afternoon," he said. DA pushed for no bail given the interstate element and the prior charges. Judge is sympathetic. Our contact says it's very likely he stays in until trial. "And the trial timeline?" Callum asked. Given Sandra's statement and the physical evidence they pulled from the motel room, Declan paused. There was a lot of physical evidence in that motel room, Callum. Photographs of Nola, printed records of her movements, notes in handwriting that read like a hunting log. His voice was flat, but the flatness was doing a lot of work. The DA is talking about adding stalking with intent. With everything together, he's looking at serious time. Callum stared at his desk. A hunting log. He had known this about Garrett Hale intellectually, from the file, from the pattern of the prior charges, from the way he had moved through the city over the past week. But hearing it stated plainly still landed differently than reading it in a report. "Does Nola need to know the details?" Declan asked. "The extent of what they found." "Some of it," Callum said. "Eventually, when she's ready. Not today." "Agreed," Declan said. "I'll keep it clean for now." A pause. "You did right by her, Callum." "She did right by herself," Callum said. "She did that long before I came into it." He hung up and sat quietly with that thought. At 10:30, there was a knock at his office door. He knew who it was before he said, "Come in," because only one person knocked exactly that way in this house, 3 times evenly spaced, with the knuckle rather than the flat of the hand. Mrs. Doyle opened the door. "She's awake," she said. "Fed the baby. Ate breakfast the whole plate, which is the first time I've seen that." Something in her expression shifted. "She's asking for you." He stood up immediately, which he registered as notable, the immediacy of it, the absence of the usual calculation. Nola was sitting up in the bed with Josephine in her arms and a color in her face that hadn't been there yesterday. Not the gray exhaustion, but something warmer underneath it. She looked up when Callum came in, and the first thing she said was, "He's in custody. Mrs. Doyle told me." "Since last night," he said. She nodded slowly. She looked down at Josephine. "I keep waiting to feel more," she said. "I thought I would feel, I don't know, more, bigger, something dramatic." She shook her head slightly. "Mostly I just feel tired and hungry, which Mrs. Doyle sorted out." She paused. "And something else I don't have a word for yet." "Relief takes time to arrive," Callum said. "When you've been running that long, your body doesn't know how to stop all at once. It comes in stages." She looked at him. "Is that from experience?" "Yes," he said simply. She accepted that without pressing it, which was one of the things about Nola he had come to appreciate in these 2 weeks. She knew which questions to ask and which ones to leave alone. "I want to talk about what happens next," she said. "I need to make a plan." You just had a baby 14 hours ago." "I'm aware," she said. "I was there." A faint, dry note in it that made something in him ease. "I'm not saying do it today. I'm saying I need to think about it because thinking about it is how I function." She looked at him levelly. "Don't try to stop me from planning. It's how I survived." "I wouldn't dream of it," he said. He sat down in the chair that had become his chair in this room over the past 24 hours and leaned back and let her talk, because she needed to talk and he needed to listen, and those two things fit together more naturally than he would have predicted 2 weeks ago. She talked about finding her own place, a 2-bedroom, if she could manage it somewhere, with good light and a school district she had already researched, which meant she had been researching school districts while 8.5 months pregnant and working nights, which was so entirely Nola that it didn't even surprise him. She talked about whether she could go back to the cleaning agency or whether that connection was too compromised now. She talked about money plainly and without embarrassment, what she had saved and what she needed and what the math looked like. He listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not offer solutions before she had finished laying out the problem, because he understood instinctively that the laying out was as important as the solving. When she finished, she looked at him with that straight-on gaze. "Say what you're thinking," she said. "I'm thinking you don't have to do any of that immediately," he said. "I'm thinking the guest suite has a private bath and good light and isn't going anywhere. And I'm thinking you are not in any condition physically or otherwise to be navigating apartment leases and agency transfers in the next 30 days. You can't just stay," he said, simply, not as an order. "Just stay until you're ready. There's no timeline, there's no debt, there's nothing you owe at the other end of it. Just stay until you don't need to anymore." She was quiet. "That's a complicated thing to accept," she said finally. "I know," he said. "I don't want to be someone's project," she said. The words were careful and specific. "I've been someone's project before, and it always comes with a cost I can't afford." "You're not a project," he said. "You're Nola Ferris from South Boston, and you are the person who taught me when I was 9 years old, and too proud to ask for help, that receiving something gracefully was its own kind of strength." He paused. "I'm giving you back the lesson." She stared at him. He watched her process it, turn it over, examine it from every angle with that thorough, unsentimental intelligence of hers. Josephine made a sound. Nola looked down at her, and something in her face did the thing it had done in the first moments last night, the thing that had made Callum look at the wall, open and absolute and beyond defending. "She deserves stability more than I deserve pride," Nola said quietly. "That's what I keep coming back to." "She's going to deserve a lot of things," Callum said. "Start with the basics." Nola looked up at him. Something had settled in her expression. A decision made the way she made decisions thoroughly and without wasted motion. "Okay," she said. And then for the first time she almost smiled when she said it. "I noticed I keep saying that to you." "You do," he said. "It's a very you word," she said. "You say it like it closes a contract." "Doesn't it?" She considered that. "I suppose it does." She looked at him for a moment longer. "Thank you, Callum. Not for any specific thing. For the whole of it." He nodded once because he didn't have better words than that, and she would understand the nod. At noon, his phone buzzed with a message from Declan that was a single line. Judge denied bail. Garrett Hale was in county until trial, and trial was not going to be a short road for him. Sandra's video statement had been entered into the record. 2 prior charges had been formally reopened. The DA's office, according to Declan's contact, was building a case they were confident in. Callum read the message and typed back one word: "Good." Then he sat at his desk, and for a long, quiet hour he worked through the 17 messages he had ignored that morning, his actual life, the businesses and the operations, and the moving parts of the world he had built. While down the hall, a woman who had worked in his house for 3 weeks as a ghost was sleeping with her daughter for the first time in a room where the windows opened and the lock was on the inside. He thought not for the first time about the particular way things came back around, about how he had spent 20 years building something powerful enough to protect what mattered, and had only now in this house, in this week, understood what it was he had been building it for. At 2 in the afternoon, Mrs. Doyle knocked and said there was a call from Declan marked urgent and he should take it. He picked up. "Tell me." "Garrett Hale made a statement at arraignment," Declan said. "Before his attorney could stop him. The judge has it on record now." A pause. "He said that when he gets out, he's going to finish what he started with Nola and the baby." The room was very quiet. "He said that in open court," Callum said. In front of the judge, the DA3 journalist covering the docket and his own attorney, who looked like she wanted to disappear through the floor. Declan's voice was steady, but something underneath it was not. His attorney tried to walk it back. DA moved immediately to add terroristic threatening to the charges. Judge looked like she aged 5 years and then said, and I quote, "Bail is not being considered, period." Callum stood up from his desk. He walked to the window. He looked at the gate, at the quiet street beyond it, at the ordinary afternoon moving past, and he thought about the statement Garrett Hale had just made in open court in front of journalists, and what that meant for the case and for Nola and for the next however many months. "She's going to hear about this," Callum said. "It'll be in the news by 4 o'clock, Declan said. "The journalists were live tweeting the docket. It's already out." "Then I tell her before she finds it herself," Callum said. He stood with the phone against his ear and looked at the street and thought about how a man had just destroyed his own case in open court because he could not even in front of a judge contain the thing that drove him. Because the control was the point. The terror was the currency. Even being arrested hadn't interrupted the reflex to threaten to claim to Mark. "Is this good for us or bad for us?" Callum asked. "Good," Declan said. "Unambiguously good. He just handed them everything they needed to lock this up for years. But she'll hear it, and it'll undo some of the mourning," Callum said. "Yes." He hung up. He stood for another moment. Then he went down the hall. Nola was awake. She was sitting up with Josephine, and she had the look of someone who had rested enough to feel human again. And when Callum came through the door, she read his face immediately. "What happened?" she said. Flat, steady, not a question. He sat down. He told her plainly all of it, what Garrett had said in open court. What it meant legally, what it meant for the case, what the DA was doing with it. He gave her every piece of it because she had always wanted every piece of it, and she had always known what to do with hard information better than most people did, with easy information. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat with it for a moment, her hand moving in slow circles on Josephine's back. "He said that in front of a judge," she said. "Yes." "He couldn't even help himself," she said, softly, almost to herself. "Even there, even then." She shook her head, not with the disbelief of someone who hadn't known him, but with the terrible recognizing clarity of someone who had known him very well. He never could stand not having the last word. "It cost him everything," Callum said. "It always costs everyone around him everything," she said. "Him too, apparently, when the audience is the wrong one." She was quiet for a moment. "Is this going to hold the case?" "It's going to hold," Callum said. "What he said today made it stronger than it was this morning." She looked down at Josephine. The baby was asleep, with the deep, total confidence of someone who had decided things were fine and had no interest in revising that assessment. "She's never going to know him," Nola said. "Not with anger, with certainty. She's going to grow up not knowing what it even felt like to be afraid of someone who was supposed to love you." Her voice dropped. "That's everything. That's the whole thing. That's all I ever wanted." Callum looked at her. At this woman who had carried an entire catastrophe alone for 6 months and worked the late shift and climbed on step stools and refused to break, who had walked into his house like a ghost and who was now sitting in his guest suite with her daughter asleep on her chest and her spine straight and her eyes clear. "She's going to know what it feels like to be safe," he said. Nola looked at him. Something in her face opened up slowly, the way light came through after a long gray stretch. Not all at once, not dramatically, just steadily and without apology. "Yeah," she said quietly. "She is." 3 weeks after Josephine came into the world, Nola woke up at 6 in the morning without an exit plan in her head for the first time in 6 months. She lay there and noticed it the way you noticed the absence of a sound you had grown so used to that you stopped hearing it until it stopped. No calculation of doors and distances, no inventory of what she could carry, no rehearsed version of what she would say to whoever tried to stop her. Just the quiet of the house, and Josephine in the small bassinet Mrs. Doyle had produced from somewhere in the third-floor storage, and the pale morning coming through the window that opened. She stayed still for a long moment and let herself feel the shape of it. Then Josephine made the particular sound that meant she was 30 seconds from escalating, and Nola was out of bed before the second sound came, and the morning began the way mornings had begun for 3 weeks now, in the specific, beautiful, exhausting rhythm of a new life, demanding everything and giving back something that had no name. She was feeding Josephine when Mrs. Doyle knocked and came in with tea and sat in the chair across the room with the ease of someone who had made that chair her own over the past weeks, which she had, and looked at Nola with those sharp eyes. "You slept," Mrs. Doyle said. "Not a question, an observation." "Almost 5 hours," Nola said. "Consecutively." "Progress," Mrs. Doyle said, with the satisfaction of someone whose project was going well. She sipped her tea. "He's already up, in the office since 5. Nola did not ask who she meant, because there was only one he in this house that Mrs. Doyle referred to that way with that particular weight. "Is he always like that?" "Always," Mrs. Doyle said. "Since I've known him, the man runs on 4 hours and stubbornness." Nola looked down at Josephine. "He came by last night, after 10, just knocked, asked if we needed anything, and left when I said we were fine." She paused. "He does that." "Every night," Mrs. Doyle confirmed. "He doesn't have to." "No," Mrs. Doyle agreed. "He doesn't do things he doesn't have to. That's one of his more useful qualities." Nola was quiet for a moment, listening to the house settle around them in the morning. "What was he like?" she asked. "Before all of this. Before she made a small gesture that encompassed the house and the gate, and everything implied by both." Mrs. Doyle considered the question with the genuine seriousness it deserved. "Careful," she said finally. "Not cold. People think it's cold, but it isn't. It's careful. Like a man who burned himself badly once and learned exactly how close to stand to the fire after that." She set down her teacup. "Finding you changed something. I don't know what exactly, but I've worked for him 8 years, and I know the difference." Nola didn't respond to that. She shifted Josephine to her shoulder and began the rhythmic patting that had become second nature in 3 weeks, and she thought about careful men and the things that made them that way, and she thought about South Boston and a mattress on a floor and a boy who had been the oldest person in every room he walked into. At 9 o'clock, there was a different knock at the door, Callum's knock 3 times evenly spaced. "Come in," she said. He was already in his jacket, which meant he had somewhere to be, but he came in and stopped inside the door with his hands in his pockets and looked at Josephine in the bassinet with the expression he always had around the baby, which was not quite what she expected from a man who ran whatever Callum ran. It was something more like respect, like he was taking her seriously as a person already, and she was 3 weeks old. "There's something you need to know," he said. Nola's attention sharpened immediately. "Tell me." Garrett's attorney filed a motion yesterday to have the Sandra testimony excluded on a technicality. He said it plainly, watching her face. The DA's office pushed back before close of business. The judge rejected the motion this morning at 8:15. She let out a breath. That was fast. The judge, as it turns out, has a very limited tolerance for men who make explicit threats in her courtroom and then try to dismantle the cases against them on procedural grounds. Something in his voice was dry and precise. "She is not enjoying Garrett Hale." "Good," Nola said, simply and completely. "There's more," Callum said. He sat down in the chair Mrs. Doyle had vacated. "Caroline reached out." Nola went still. "Caroline?" "The first woman. She saw the news coverage of the arraignment. She called our lawyer directly, which means she found us somehow, which means she was looking." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice steady. "She wants to add her statement to the record. She said, and I'm telling you this exactly, she said she spent 3 years telling herself it wasn't bad enough to matter, and she's done telling herself that. Nola pressed her lips together. She looked at the bassinet where Josephine was sleeping with her complete unconscious confidence. How many women did he do this to? We know of 3, Callum said. Could be more. The DA is investigating. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was controlled, but something beneath it was shaking very slightly. I used to think I was weak, she said, for staying as long as I did, for believing him when he said I made him that way. She stopped. Knowing about Caroline and Sandra doesn't make the 4 years better, but she searched for the word. It relocates it. It puts it where it actually belongs. On him? Callum said. On him? She agreed. He looked at her for a moment. You were never weak, he said. I want to say that directly, because I don't think anyone has said it to you directly, and it needs to be said. She looked at him. Something behind her eyes moved. Callum, you were surviving, he said. That is not weakness. That is the hardest kind of strength there is because it doesn't look like anything. It just looks like endurance from the outside. He paused. I know what endurance looks like. I grew up watching it. She held his gaze for a long moment. The thing behind her eyes settled into something steadier. Okay, she said. 5th time. But this one sounded different from the others. The others had been acceptance, resignation, the closing of a contract. This one sounded like something chosen. He stayed another 10 minutes talking through the trial timeline with her, what the DA expected, what her role would likely be, what support the victim's advocate office would provide. He gave her information the way he always gave her information, completely and without softening the edges, because he had understood from the first night that she functioned best with the full picture, and worst when people tried to protect her from it. When he stood to leave, he paused at the door. There's something else, he said. She waited. I'd like to set up a trust, he said, for Josephine. Education, healthcare, whatever she needs. Fully separate from anything to do with you or me or this house. Just hers, in her name. The room was very quiet. That is an enormous thing, Nola said carefully. It's money, he said. I have a significant amount of it, and very few people I want to spend it on. Callum, think about it, he said. Don't answer now. Just think about it. He looked at Josephine in the bassinet. She didn't choose any of what happened before she got here. She should have something that's entirely uncomplicated. He looked back at Nola. Think about it. He left. Nola sat in the quiet for a long time after, with Josephine sleeping 3 feet away, and the morning fully arrived outside the window, and she thought about what it meant to be offered something with no visible cost, and how that was the hardest thing of all to trust, because she had learned over a long time and at significant expense that the invisible costs were always the highest ones. But she also thought about Callum at 9 years old receiving half a sandwich from a girl who simply understood that he needed it and didn't make an event of it. She thought about what she had believed then, which was that some people were just made to give without counting. She thought about whether she had been right. She thought she had been right. 2 weeks later, in early December, Nola was in the kitchen at 7 in the morning making coffee because Mrs. Doyle had the day off, and the kitchen was different without her, quieter and somehow larger when Callum came in from the outside still in his coat, which meant he had been out before she was up, which was not unusual. He stopped when he saw her. You're up early. Joe woke at 4 and then went back down, but I couldn't, she said. You walked the grounds, he said. I do that sometimes. I know. I've seen you from the window. She poured a second cup without asking and set it on the counter near him, and he picked it up, and they stood in the kitchen in the early morning in a way that had become, without either of them formally acknowledging it, a habit. Trial date was confirmed, he said. March 14th. I know. The DA's office called yesterday. She wrapped both hands around her cup. Caroline is flying in from Denver. She wants to meet me. Callum looked at her. How do you feel about that? Terrified, she said without hesitation, and like I have to, like I owe it to her to show up and look her in the face because she's doing the hard thing for me and for Sandra, and I can at least be present for it. You don't owe her anything, he said. I know, she said. I want to. That's different. He studied her for a moment with that particular quality of attention he had, the one that wasn't evaluating but simply present. "You're different than you were 6 weeks ago," he said. She considered that. "I sleep more." "That's not what I mean." "I know what you mean," she said. She looked down at her cup. "I'm starting to believe it's over. I couldn't before. I kept waiting for the other shoe, the motion that would get his charges dropped, the witness who would recant, the thing that would undo it." She was quiet for a moment. "I think I'm starting to actually believe it." "It's over," he said. "He's not coming back from this." "The attorney," she said suddenly, and something in her voice changed. He looked at her. "What about the attorney?" "His defense attorney. She filed 3 separate motions in November, and all 3 were rejected. Yesterday she withdrew from the case." Nola looked at him with something sharp in her eyes. "The DA's office said it's unusual for a private attorney to withdraw this close to trial. They said it could mean the defendant is unmanageable, that he's refusing to cooperate with his own defense." Callum was quiet for a moment. "I heard the same thing." "He's going to lose," Nola said, slowly, like she was testing the reality of it. "He's going to stand up in that courtroom in March, and he's going to lose, and he made it happen himself. Every bad decision, every threat in front of a judge, every moment he couldn't control himself, he handed them the case." She shook her head. "He couldn't stop being what he is, even when it cost him everything." "Some people can't," Callum said. "I know," she said. "I used to think that meant there was something wrong with me for not being able to fix it." A beat. "Now I think it just means there was something wrong with him." The morning moved around them. Josephine's voice came through the baby monitor on the counter, not distressed, just awake and informing the world of that fact, and Nola set down her cup immediately, and Callum picked up the monitor and handed it to her before she had to reach for it, and she took it and went down the hall, and for a moment after she left the kitchen, was very still. Callum stood with his coffee and thought about March and courtrooms and a man who had destroyed his own defense through sheer inability to contain himself, and he thought about how sometimes the best outcome was the one where you barely had to do anything at all, where the weight of what someone was simply collapsed in on them without requiring any intervention beyond the removal of the people they had been feeding on. He thought about what Declan had told him 2 days ago, which he had not yet told Nola, which was that 3 more women had come forward to the DA's office after the news coverage of the arraignment and the explicit threat Garrett had made in open court. 3 more. Which brought the total to 6, which meant the man had been doing this for longer and more systematically than even the investigators had initially understood. He would tell Nola eventually, when she was further from the immediate weight of it, when the information could land as confirmation rather than fresh damage. He drank his coffee and went to his office, and at 9:15 Declan called. "The public defender assigned to replace Garrett's private attorney," Declan said. "She reached out to the DA's office this morning. Apparently her client told her in their first meeting that the charges don't apply to him because the women involved misunderstood what their relationship was." Callum said nothing. "She's asking the court to order a psychological evaluation," Declan said. "Will it delay the trial?" "The DA doesn't think so. They've been expecting this move. They're ready for it." He paused. "But Callum, the evaluation could surface in public record. If it does, it's going to be in the news. Nola will see it." "She can handle it," Callum said. "You sure?" He thought about Nola in the kitchen an hour ago, saying, "I think I'm starting to actually believe it." He thought about the quality of her voice when she said it, the tentative, earned, still fragile newness of it. "She can handle it," he said again, "but I'll tell her before it's public. She doesn't read surprises well." "Understandable," Declan said, "given the past 6 months." "Given the past 6 years," Callum said. He spent the rest of the morning working. At noon, he heard Josephine in the hallway, which meant Nola was walking her the way she did when the baby was restless, slow laps of the downstairs hall that she had mapped out in her first week of recovery and returned to now by habit. He heard Nola's voice, low and conversational, talking to Josephine the way she always talked to her, as if the baby was a full participant in the discussion, which Nola had once told him was because she intended to raise a person who expected to be taken seriously, and that started before they could talk back. He listened to it without moving from his desk. the voice moving down the hall and back steady and quiet, and under it, the occasional sound of Josephine processing the information. At 1:30 he went to find her. She was in the south sitting room with Josephine asleep in her arms, sitting very still, the way new mothers learn to sit when the baby finally went down and the cost of moving was too high to consider. She looked up when he came in. "Psychological evaluation," she said immediately. He stopped. "You know, the DA's victim advocate called me an hour ago," she said. "She said they're required to notify me of significant procedural developments." Her voice was even. "She said it's a delay tactic, and they're ready for it, and it won't work. She said it in the careful way that people say things when they think you might fall apart." "You didn't fall apart," Callum said. "No," she agreed. "I've been sitting here trying to figure out why not." She looked down at Josephine. "I think it's because I already knew what he was. A psychological evaluation isn't going to tell me anything I didn't live through." She paused. "What it tells everyone else, the judge, the jury, the public, that's different. Let them see it. Let them see all of it." "That's exactly what the DA said," Callum told her. "Then we're thinking the same way," she said simply. He sat across from her. She was looking at him with that clear-eyed directness that he had stopped being surprised by and had started simply expecting, which was its own kind of shift in him. "I've been thinking about the trust," she said. He waited. "I want to accept it," she said. "Not for me. I want to be clear about that. For Jo, because you're right that she didn't choose any of what came before her, and she should have something that's entirely hers." She met his eyes. "But I need one condition." "Name it," he said. "I need it to be fully in her name. Nothing that connects it to you in any way she'll have to explain to anyone when she's older. Not that she should be ashamed of where it came from, but because she's going to build her own life, and I don't want her carrying the weight of an obligation she never agreed to." He looked at her for a moment. "That's a completely reasonable condition," he said. "And it's exactly how I intended to structure it." She exhaled. "Okay," she said, and this time it sounded like a door opening rather than one closing. He nodded. He started to stand and she said, "Wait," and he sat back down. She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't quite seen on her before, not the wariness, not the careful assessment, not the controlled composure she wore like armor. Something more unguarded than any of those. "What is this?" she asked. "What is this that we're doing? You and me, in this house?" She said it without accusation, without fear, with a directness that was entirely characteristic of her and entirely terrifying in the best possible way. "Because I need to know what I'm living in. I can't be in something I don't understand." The question sat between them like something alive. He looked at her. He thought about the easy answer, which was that she was a guest recovering from a difficult situation, and he was a person who had chosen to help. He thought about whether that answer was true. He decided it was not true in any way that mattered. "I don't know exactly," he said. "I know that I haven't wanted to come home in a long time, and I know that changed." He said it without decoration. "I know that I think about you differently than I think about other things in my life, and I've been careful about it because you are not in a place to be pushed into anything, and I am aware of that." He met her eyes. "I know that I would like to find out what it is, slowly, when you're ready. With no timeline and no pressure and no cost, if you decide the answer is that it's nothing more than what it already is." She looked at him for a long time. Josephine breathed quietly in her arms. "You have been so careful," she said softly, "this whole time. So careful not to be another person who wants something from me." "Because I'm not," he said. "I want something for you. That's different." She pressed her lips together. Something behind her eyes was working through something that had no simple name. "I'm not ready," she said finally. "I want you to know that I hear you and I'm not indifferent to it. But I'm not ready. I'm 5 weeks out from something that took 6 years to survive, and I have a 5-week-old daughter, and I don't trust my own heart yet. I don't trust that I know the difference between gratitude and something real." "That's honest," he said. "It's the least I can do," she said. "It's enough," he said. "It's more than enough. Take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him with something that was almost surprised, which told him that people in her life had not often said they were not going anywhere, and meant it. "You're very strange, Callum Brennan," she said quietly. "People say that," he agreed. "I mean it as a compliment," she said. In March, Garrett Hale stood trial. He was convicted on all primary counts: aggravated assault stalking with intent unlawful imprisonment, and 2 reopened prior charges that Caroline's testimony had made undeniable. Sandra sat 3 rows behind Nola in the courtroom, and they did not speak during the proceedings. But when the verdict was read, Sandra reached forward and put her hand briefly on Nola's shoulder, and Nola put her hand over Sandra's, and that was enough. That was everything. That was the entire language of what they shared, compressed into 5 seconds of contact. Garrett Hale received 14 years. His public defender stood very still. He did not look at this gallery when it was read, which Nola thought afterward was the most telling thing, that even at the end his instinct was to deny the audience he had spent years creating for himself. Nola walked out of that courthouse on a cold March afternoon with Josephine against her chest in the carrier she'd learned to manage with one hand, and the sky was the pale blue of early spring that hadn't fully committed to warmth yet, and she stood on the steps and breathed the outside air for a long moment. Callum was beside her. He had been in the gallery 3 rows back for every day of the trial, quiet and present, and entirely unobtrusive, which for a man of his particular presence in a room was a deliberate and sustained act of will that she had noticed and not remarked on, because some things were more powerful unremarked. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he confirmed. She looked at the street, at the city moving past in its ordinary afternoon business, at all the people who had no idea what had just happened in the building behind her, and didn't need to, because the world contained entire catastrophes and entire resolutions, and mostly it kept moving either way. "I want to go home," she said. She said it without thinking about it, and then heard what she had said, and went still for a moment. Callum said nothing. He waited. "I said home," she said quietly. "You did," he said. She turned and looked at him. Josephine moved in the carrier against her chest, awake, now looking out at the street, with the serious, concentrated attention she brought to everything which Nola had decided was entirely her own personality, and nothing inherited from anyone who didn't deserve her. "I think I meant it," Nola said. "I know you did," Callum said. They walked to the car. In the back seat with Josephine strapped into her seat and looking out the window at the moving city, Nola sat very still and felt the shape of this life she had landed in, the size of it, the warmth of it, the particular solidity of it that she had not believed in for a very long time. She thought about 6 months of running. She thought about a motel in Providence with a broken heater and a diner shift that started at 5 in the morning, and a baby that kicked when she was scared, as if even then Josephine was telling her to keep going. She thought about walking into a house that turned out to be Callum Brennan's house, and the particular collision of all of it that had seemed like disaster and had turned out to be something she did not yet have the right word for. She thought she would find the word eventually. She was in no hurry. At 6 months, Josephine discovered her own hands and spent 3 full days amazed by them, which Nola reported to Callum over the kitchen table on a Thursday evening with the kind of delight that was entirely unself-conscious, the kind she had stopped editing before it reached her face. At 7 months, Nola enrolled in the accounting program she had been planning to complete before Garrett, and sat at the desk in the South Suite with her textbooks open and Josephine and the bouncer beside her, studying, while her daughter watched her with that grave, attentive gaze. And Nola told her in a low voice that women who understood numbers could not be controlled by people who controlled money, and that this was the first lesson. At 8 months, Caroline flew in from Denver, and they had dinner in the kitchen, just the 2 of them, and talked for 4 hours. And what happened in those 4 hours was private and necessary and belonged to them entirely. At 9 months, Nola told Callum she was ready. She said it the same way she said everything, directly, and without preamble, on a Tuesday morning over coffee, and he looked at her for a long moment and said, "Okay," and she almost laughed at the word coming back around to him. Almost a year to the day after Callum had seen a bruise shaped like someone's grip on the wrist of a woman on a step stool in his hallway, he sat across from Nola at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening, the way they always sat on Thursdays now, and Josephine was in her high chair smearing sweet potato across the tray with the focused, creative energy of a person who had decided this was art. And Mrs. Doyle was making the sound she made when the baby did something she found secretly delightful but was too professional to admit. Nola was talking about her accounting practicum, something about a client whose books were a catastrophe and what she intended to do about it. And her hands moved when she talked the way they always did now, freely and without monitoring. And she looked at him when she got to the part she found most interesting to check if he was following, which he always was. He thought about the ghost who had worked in his house for 3 weeks with her sleeves down and her head down and her whole self compressed into the smallest possible space. He thought about what it had cost her to become invisible and what it had taken to become visible again. He looked at her. She was laughing now at something she had just said, and Josephine, responding to the sound, was laughing too, with the full-body commitment of someone who had never learned to hold anything back. The house was loud. The house was warm. The house was full. Callum Brennan, who had spent 20 years building something powerful enough to protect what mattered, finally understood that all of this, the Thursday kitchen and the laughing baby and the woman who had taught him at 9 years old that strength was knowing when to give without being asked, was what he had been protecting all along. He just hadn't known her name for it yet. Now he did, and he intended to keep it.